my co-author who is on this video conference, Mahendra Gupta, who was the dean of at Olin Business School at Washington University in St. Louis when I was a faculty there. And he is a professor of accounting, and he and Tom Smith know each other from grad school. So so it's great. I'm part of the old Chicago Rochester tradition where I'm not looking for polite applause. Polite applause really is a waste of your very valuable time and my much less valuable time. What we need from you is honest feedback, and the more brutal, the better. As we used to be told in Rochester, you need to be old enough and ugly enough to handle the truth. Otherwise, go do something else. So look, at the end of it, you might say, look, Rajiv, Mahendra, well tried. This is not going anywhere. Why don't you go do something else? And if that's your advice, we'll take it with due respect. But if you think that it is worth, it has a future, then if you would kindly put this lens on as to what could be potentially a good home for this paper in a journal that you might recommend. So without further ado, let me go on, and please interrupt me if you have any questions. And I might say, okay, well, I'll address this in a few minutes, but it would be great if you can just let me know right away if you have a question or a suggestion or a comment. And all right, so right, so what are our research questions? In the presence of asymmetric information, how do you go about objectively and systematically measure the probabilities of diligence and objectivity? And from there, take on, how do you measure the probability of moral hazard? Up to this, we'll talk about probability of diligence, objectivity, and moral hazard. For the next question, how to measure adverse selection and report quality, there we won't be able to measure the probabilities, and I will get to you that in a brief while. So we'll have indices of those, and that for adverse selection and report quality, we need some additional empirical conditions to make those happen. One thing that we need to be very upfront with you all is that we do not explicitly model the incentive structures in this paper. And that is, it's potentially a weakness, but we think it's a challenge, that it is something we would love to be able to work with any of you. We at this point do not have the data, and we also don't feel we have the full conceptual model to figure that in, but it would be something that would, Mahendra and I would be very excited about the possibility of joint research.
So Rajiv, a comment at this stage.
Yes.
I don't think we're going to criticize you for not modeling the incentive structures. The 3 bullet points above that seem incredibly ambitious for one paper.
Yes.
Yeah, incredibly ambitious.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, Tom, at the end of the presentation, if you can say, as you probably know about me, I'm in anything, something looks like box ticking, that kind of like, that's too non-nuanced for me. But, but if you can at the end say, yeah, it is very ambitious. Have you come even close to trying to model it?
I wasn't saying that as a criticism. I'm saying that we're not going to criticize you for not doing a 4th thing. The 3 things right. You're doing are incredibly ambitious.
Excellent. So, but Tom and everybody else, if you have ideas on the modeling the incentive structures after the end of the paper, either we can talk on this presentation or via email. That would be an absolutely wonderful collaborative work going forward. Okay, so we apply our framework. So far, what we have done in this is in the context of asymmetric information. So for instance, I'm diabetic. So when I go to the endocrinologist, there is so much asymmetric information. I know some things about myself. For instance, what food I'm eating, what exercise I'm doing. That the doctor does not have access to. But on the other hand, doctor has her own expertise that she has more richness about. What she can do is to say, the diligence part of it is to say, I'm going to get you to take blood tests, which then can provide some information that is over and above what you are self-reporting. All right. So all of that is our model is about asymmetric information. However, we are able to apply it to analyst forecasts about studied firms because we have the data and also because Mahendra is an accounting professor. I'm a financial economist. So this is clearly something that we are very interested in. And it's because of the fact that the studied firm is providing guidance to the market as well, that we need that particular variable that is correlated with actual earnings to make our model work. And then we are going to spend quite a bit of time as to how are these variables impacted by important capital markets of the recent past. Because of the data limitations, IBIS is its mapping to analysts and analyst firms is notoriously unreliable. We are not able to separate out the analyst and the analyst firm. So we are using the analyst firm combination as the J of our model. I is the studied firm, and all our measures are measured at that IJ level. Studied firm, analyst firm combination. But to kind of, so that we don't keep saying it, I'm going to say analyst. Also, we do a lot of Bayesian work, and the Bayesian posterior probability, we'll refer to it as the empirical probability. No good reason. All right, so what is diligence? Now, first, we are going to just talk about the concept of it and how we are planning to measure it. The concept is that diligence by for instance, my endocrinologist would require her to acquire and analyze information specific to my diabetes, even potentially information that is not available to me. Whereas in the absence of diligence, she would just rely on publicly available information or what I tell her. So that is the concept of diligence. And we are going to take the Bayesian approach to it, and we are going to set up a non-diligence model. We are going to set up a diligence model and compare the two using Hausmann specification test, and that gives us asymptotically the probability of diligence. Objectivity is the concept is far simpler and far more powerful. Objectivity is where my endocrinologist sees my blood sugar level and sees my things, and does she actually tell me or my insurance company what the truth is? Or does she go, you know what? She knows that I'm diabetic, but she tells me, go eat as much sugar as you want, go drink as much alcohol as you want, no need to do exercise. That would be non-objective. Now, this is where you can see why the incentive structures would be so interesting. Because as we often criticize the American healthcare system, that doctors are compensated on keeping their patients unwell because they get paid to actually treat them rather than to their overall health. So we need to have a sense of what this is. So objectivity is much more straightforward, is that the analyst forecast should be exactly equal to its best estimate about studied firms' earnings. And we'll get much more explicit about what this all means. And again, we'll take the Bayesian approach. We'll compare the objectivity model. We'll compare the non-objectivity model, and we'll get the Wald test will give us the empirical probability asymptotically again to get the diligence. Once you have diligence and objectivity, moral hazard follows, because moral hazard is low diligence and low objectivity. Therefore, then the probability of moral hazard, because we have some independence conditions, is 1 minus the product of the probabilities of diligence and objectivity. Okay, now so far I did not make any further assumption about the actual disclosure of actual earnings. So for the rest of this paper, we're going to say that when the firm discloses its earnings at the beginning of the next quarter, it is actually a true disclosure. We don't, for diligence, objectivity, and moral hazard, we do not need these assumptions. So it's a strong assumption, we agree. But if we make these additional assumptions, then we can tease out adverse selection. How do we do that? We take accuracy, you regress it on the probability of moral hazard, and you control for all uncertainty variables. Whatever is left is a negative function of the adverse selection. It's not a probability. Okay, it's an index. And then from that, we can tease out competence of analyst, which is general and or specific. Remember, all measures are at the IJ level. So competence includes fit. My wife used to work as an analyst, and they were very specialized in what firms they would cover. And so the fit is very important. And so then these will, but this fits in with a lot of the literature that talks about quality of analyst forecast. Methodology, the first is the vast and sophisticated literature on asymmetric information, especially moral hazard and adverse selection, including our good friend Simon Grant at ANU, who I presented at ANU. Simon was very helpful in a lot of his comments. And then Kyle and Obijayeva. Kyle Pete's a former colleague of mine and a former colleague of Tom Smith. And you're running buddy, I'm told, Tom. Then we have McDonald and Marks. Glenn is my dissertation supervisor and my former colleague, and Mahendra's colleague at Olin. And of course, Bob Aumann, the legendary Nobel Prize winner, George Akerlof, my former colleague, and going all the back to Friedman and Savage. This is a very, very sophisticated literature, and we don't think of our paper as a contribution to this asymmetric information, but we need it to be firmly anchored here. The second bullet point is relatively new, is the statistical literature on the relationship between the frequentist concept of p-value and the Bayesian posterior probability. And interestingly enough, most of this literature is actually not in econometrics or finance or accounting. It's a lot of these are in biostatistics. Some of these papers are even in medicine journals because they actually spend a lot of time working through this. And so once again, ours is not a contribution to it, but it was very helpful to be able to rely upon this literature to get our asymptotic results about probability. So role of accounting reports in informing financial markets has a long and distinguished history since Ball and Brown. Phil Brown was a very active participant in the seminar that I presented at UWA last week. It was wonderful. And Ray Ball, I've actually been Ray Ball's research assistant, co-author, friend, and a fellow cricket enthusiast. So it was great to be able to refer to Ball and Brown, Fama, Fisher, Jensen, and Roll, and all of these legendary scholars. We are going to, toward the end of this paper, talk about the regulations by the US SEC and FINRA and what the impacts of those are on all these measures that we are talking about. And once again, there is literature in this, and including Call, Sharp, and Wong, and goes back quite a while. For any of you, if you want to talk more about these papers, we definitely can. Our objective has been to make sure that our paper is consistent with what they are doing, and make sure that we apply all the work that they have done. Accuracy of analyst forecasts, that is a very, very interesting literature, not quite directly relevant to us, because a lot of their accuracy, for instance, that talk about whether, some of the results, for instance, our analyst forecasts are more accurate than management guidance, for instance, if the uncertainties are more macro level. So those are great literature. Our objective is to say we want our definitions of accuracy, etc., to be consistent, to be firmly anchored in the literature. And then the competence of diligence determine report quality. Once again, we take the definitions directly from the literature. Once again, this is very much an accounting and some financial economists in this world as well. We do not, once again, relationships of analyst forecasts, recommendations, and management guidance. I kind of alluded to some of it earlier, where they talk about how those are related. Obviously, because we do analyst forecasts and management guidance in this paper, so we need to be very familiar with this literature. But our paper is only insofar as we are using analyst forecasts and management guidance. We do not try to answer questions like which are more accurate and so on. If this is something that we need to do, and if that's your opinion, then we'll definitely take it under advisement. Once again, back to what we were discussing earlier, this is a fabulous literature, and we would love to be able to take our paper forward and do work on incentives. And in particular, because of my long work in consulting, I do have this very kind of a strong interest in policy, and we would love to see some of those, figure out what are the appropriate measures, what the appropriate incentives ought to be to kind of say, for instance, increase the probability of diligence or increase the probability of moral hazard. And for instance, Simon Grant was mentioning if we do a cost benefit model and potentially talk about a social optimum level of a social investment in achieving those goals. But once again, that's something we do not do at this point, but we would be very appreciative of any thoughts. Access to management networks and relationships. This literature has been very influential, especially it turns out that these old boys networks are often quite powerful. There has been some work suggesting that people with foreign sounding names, for instance, don't get as much access to management, these networks. Sometimes where you went to high school, where you went to boarding school is actually more important than where you went to grad school. So those are interesting, but that's not our focus. We use multiplicative models in this paper because we need our models comparable across firms and industries, and most importantly, across time. So as a result, in order to do so, we restrict ourselves to positive actual earnings, positive management guidance, and positive analyst forecasts without substantive revisions. And without substantive revisions, I simply means if there is a revision, if they just post a revised forecast, but if the forecast is exactly the same, then we don't drop it, we keep it. It's but if they actually during for a particular period, if the forecast or the guidance it actually changes, then we drop it. And we will
why the positive earnings requirement?
In order to use
why do you need earnings to be positive?
Because we want to use multiplicative models. Because
yeah. So that probably excludes nearly 50% of the firms, right, in the given year.
I will actually. I have this tables. Okay. I'll get to that, and your intuition is very right. Yeah, it is, and I mean it is. I mean at UWA, one of the economists, she was like, you need to be able to acknowledge it, and so we have and Mahendra and I have been putting together this list of comments to. That's one of the things that we do need to as to whether. What to do or whether to say, well, leave it at this, because at the end of the day, you cannot have a firm with indefinite negative actual earnings. So we provide the detailed summary statistics. Okay, so we know a priori assumptions of the richness of the information available to the analyst compared to the richness of the information available to the studied firm. And for this, I completely give credit to Mahendra. This is the kind of example. He's very good at keeping me grounded, keeping us grounded. And he said a good analyst studying Walmart, for instance, would also potentially go to the parking lot of its competitor Target and see the kind of activity there is in the parking lot of Target. So a good analyst can potentially know more about the studied firm than the studied firm does itself. And maybe it's true, but our thing is we do not make any such a priori assumptions. Our model is general enough to allow for that being the case. Okay, basic competence is that studied firm's information about itself is at least as rich as public information, similarly, analysts' information about studied firm is at least as rich as public information. Now, we actually because I come from a strong math econ background, so there is a lot of material in the appendix with the probability theory about public information versus market information. This is public information, not necessarily the same thing as market information, because market information is something we can never really observe. We also make this relatively innocuous assumption that there is no memory loss. Some of the quasi-rational economists will probably argue with us about it, but that's empirical work. We need to have this assumption. And finally, this is the empirical foundation of our paper, is that public information is identical to the empiricists. So what we observe is what the data that we have is what we are saying is the same as the public information available to public. When I say the public, which means that everybody knows that everybody knows. That's the public information. And we'll see later that as a result, a lot of our models depend critically on what we use as public information. And this is a very empirically demanding methodology that we have. And those are extensions that we could work on. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of move through some of this stuff. The notations that we have, star is that it's unobservable to the public, left arrow is learning, right arrow is declaration. We'll use a Hebrew letter for actual variable, Roman letter for observed or announced by the studied firm, and a Greek letter for the forecast. And this is the timeline. So the unknown Aleph IT star is the actual earning of firm I in quarter T. The star says it's never observable to the econometrician or to the public. Based on alpha IT star, through information imperfection, learning imperfection, GIT star, left arrow, is the studied firm's best estimate of its own earnings. We never observe it. GIT, double arrow, the firm provides this guidance. That is publicly available information. Double arrow means it's publicly available information, which means, of course, it's available to the studied firm, the analyst, and the empiricist. Having observed this guidance and doing its diligence, phi IJT star, left arrow, is analyst J's best estimate of studied firm I's actual earnings in quarter T. We never observe it. That's a function of its own learning and analysis. That's the phi IJT star. What we do observe are the phi IJT double arrow. That's the analyst forecast that it makes about studied firm I in quarter T. In the beginning of quarter T plus 1, YIT double arrow is the firm's announced earnings about its earnings in quarter T. We, as I said earlier, we were to measure the probabilities of diligence, objectivity, and moral hazard, we do not need to make any further assumptions. But in order to get adverse selection, quality, accuracy, all of that stuff, we will make the additional assumption that this YIT double arrow, the disclosed earnings about quarter T are the same as actual earnings. So that's the, okay. So the firm's learning and announcement process, the first is the learning imperfection. The firm this log of GIT left arrow star is a function of the actual earnings plus this learning imperfection EIT star left arrow, and we allow for a systemic component. We're not forcing that to be unbiased. And there is a strategic component, which is log of GIT double arrow is a function of log of GIT star, which is left arrow, which is its best estimate, plus the strategic component. And once again, we allow for the possibility, the log of AI is the possibility of a systemic over guidance over anything and so on. So which gets us to the multiplicative model that I have been promising, that GIT double arrow is a function of this AI double arrow, which is that systemic systemic component, which we allow for it. It could be simply be one function of the actual earnings time that EIT star double arrow, which is a combination of learning imperfection and the strategic component. That so far we have talked about the learning imperfection and strategic component of the studied firm. Next thing is, what is the diligence and non-diligence by analyst? So the learning imperfection under diligence, the log of VIJT star left arrow, you can see it's a function of log of Aleph IT star of the actual earnings under diligence. The only difference between under diligence and under non-diligence is that the same equation, it's now a function of log Aleph IT star hat, the best public estimate of the actual earnings, which is obviously a function of the guidance and the over guidance parameters and so on. That is the fundamental difference between these two models. Under diligence, remember there is learning imperfection, log of epsilon IGT star. That's still there. There is learning imperfection, but the analyst under diligence learns true earnings with the learning imperfection, whereas under non-diligence, it only relies upon the best public estimate of the firm's true earnings. Now, once again, this is the strategic component. So non-objective component is the difference between log of VIJT double arrow minus what its best estimate is we model this as a function of the pi IT, which is all publicly available information, and delta IJT is the number of days between management guidance and analyst forecast, plus this non-objective component of this forecast. In the previous slide, also we had, as you can see, the pi IT and delta IJT. And so this pi IT becomes critical, and as we'll see shortly. So this here is our regression equation. Thank goodness we have a regression equation, which is a function of all observed variables. So in particular, this is that beta j ij. It's a function of the guidance adjusted by that over guidance parameter. Think of it as it could be just simply 0. That's we allow for it, and a function of the publicly available information, delta IJT, and this. So this is our regression equation. The null hypothesis says that the log of forecast is a function of alpha ij plus beta ij plus that log of alpha IJT star, where the covariance of this log Aleph IT star and the residual term is 0. Whereas the only difference here is when under diligence, however, this covariance of the the covariance of the best estimate of the unknown earnings with the residual term is no longer 0. So the difference between these two, diligence and non-diligence, is just that the covariance of the residual with management earnings guidance is 0 under non-diligence, whereas this covariance is non-zero under the alternate hypothesis of diligence. Therefore, under the null hypothesis of non-diligence, both OLS and two-stage least squares are consistent, but OLS is efficient. Whereas under the alternate hypothesis of diligence, OLS is no longer consistent, but two-stage least squares is consistent, which lets us use the classic Hausmann specification test, where the Hausmann statistic under these conditions follows a chi-square under the alternate hypothesis. And so therefore, we can use the Hausmann specification test to select between the non-diligence and the diligence model. So the empirical, the Bayesian posterior, probability of diligence by analyst firm J about studied firm I. So the probability of diligence conditional on the data asymptotically equals 1 minus the p-value. And of course, the p-value has that expression that it's a probability that comes out of this. The regression equation for objectivity, as you would expect, is it's relatively more straightforward. So you take the prediction of the best estimate under the diligence hypothesis of this of the firm analyst J's best estimate that it has about studied firm I's actual earnings in quarter T. That's the phi ijt star left arrow, which we never observed, but the predicted, we are able to measure that from the previous regression. So that then the observed phi ijt double arrow minus this prediction gives us this regression equation. This is not the same thing as just calculating the residual, because we turn out that the residual term here, the difference between under objectivity, all these alphas, betas, gammas, etas are all 0, whereas under non-objectivity they could be different. So therefore, it's a test of 0 versus non-zero coefficients, but because the covariance of the pi ijt with the residual term is not equal to 0, and the covariance of the delta ijt is also not equal to 0, we are not able to use the FEF test. We have to use the Wald test to do so. But we have the same logic. We are able to test the null hypothesis of objectivity versus the alternate hypothesis of H1 of non-objectivity by using the Wald test for non-zero coefficients. And just as we had earlier with the empirical Bayesian posterior probability, asymptotically equals the p-value. Moral hazard is low diligence and low objectivity. So therefore, the moral hazard is equal to 1 minus the probability of diligence and objectivity. If we impose, in addition, independence conditions, then this turns out to be just 1 minus the product of the probabilities of diligence and objectivity. Okay, our data, 1996 to 2000, except 2008 to 2009. Because of the great financial crisis. And we take the standard regularity conditions on the data, trading volume, non-negative price, and all that stuff. And also, we will see in a second that as we discussed, we need positive management guidance, analyst forecast, and earnings announcements. And the third sub-bullet point here, studied firms that have not changed perm nose tickers or major industry sectors during this time period, because we for our instrumentation we require we are going to use cross-sectional invariables for across other industry sectors, the 2-digit SIC code. As I mentioned earlier, the mapping from actual names of analyst firms to the codes is not reliable. There is a lot more this anonymization and reshuffling because IBIS has been so scared of getting sued. I actually had a long conversation with IBIS. Not only were they going to charge me hundreds of thousands of dollars to get me these names, but also for each such, if I wanted the actual name, they needed to get the permission of the actual analyst firm and analyst. So I would have to send 100,000 emails to make this work. So is that something to do? Maybe later, but at this point, it really doesn't affect our. Now, because of these restrictions, the losses of years and firms as a result of these restrictions is unnecessary, but not trivial. And as Phil Brown pointed out, and Tom, I will we'll look at the summary statistics in just a second. So these are the summary statistics. As you can see, the number of observations under our filters of analyst forecast is in the we have 74,000 in for this time period, and I'll just focus on the top two rows, 74,000, and the management log of management guidance that we have is 8,488. Without the filters, look at the numbers now. We have our is 126,000 observations of analyst forecast, and management guidance 11,000 observations. So Tom, your intuition was very correct. So we need to be aware of the fact that a good, honest analysis will always appreciate the limits of our analysis, and we are trying to do so. Okay, so far as we have mentioned, we have made no assumptions about the disclosure of the earnings announcement at the beginning of quarter T+1 being equal to actual earnings. And so for probability of diligence, probability of objectivity, probability of moral hazard, we don't need them. But for the rest of this paper, we need to, we will make this assumption that the actual earnings are revealed at the beginning of the next quarter, which gives us to a standard measure of the ex post normalized accuracy. And then this is a kind of a sniff test result that we find that accuracy is negatively related to moral hazard. Not particularly significant, but we don't need them to be significant. But we do need them to have that, that there be that negative relationship hold, which then says, okay, now we have accuracy, we have moral hazard. Can we tease out adverse selection? How do we do that? We regress this ex post accuracy on the probability of moral hazard, control for all relevant variables. What remains is a negative function of a decreasing function of adverse selection. So then we put in a particular functional form. Our results are really not dependent on the functional form, but it's this idea that whatever remains has to be the pre-contractual opportunism. Report quality, once again, it follows directly from the literature, the accounting literature on this one. So competence, which is low adverse selection, general and specific. So competence can be about fit, or it could be about just being an overall good analyst. And diligence, those two together determine report quality. So here, once again, we have an index of quality, which is 1 minus the index of adverse selection times the probability of diligence. This is an index, not a probability. All right, the major capital market events that we are going to talk about. Once again, the limitation of this paper is that we are really focused on the US. Is first the dot-com bubble, then Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002, the global analyst research settlements in 2003, the great financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, which in the US we often joke that it was the Full Employment Act for financial economists, and FINRA 2241. So the Global Analyst Research Settlements and FINRA 2241 are specifically about analyst behavior. So those are, the rest of all this are about financial regime changes. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go through them. First of all, this is that dot-com bubble and bust. As you can see, from 1994 to 2001. The blue line is the NASDAQ and the red line is the S&P 500. And you can see that peak on March 10, 2000. Most of us remember what we were doing when that happened. It was, and the days following. So this is the dot-com bubble. Then SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, which was the idea of increasing investor protection, which happened right after the dot-com bust and in response to Enron and its bullying auditors. So it created this public company accounting and oversight board. And we have this alphabet soup, we'll see so many of these abbreviations, it's impossible to really keep track of. But what the SOX, biggest contribution of SOX was actually imposing criminal liability on CEO and CFO to sign off on the earnings reports and so on. Once again, this is not directly related to analyst behavior, but it's about financial regime change. The next one is directly, very importantly related to our paper. This is in 2003, the SEC basically knocked heads together, put 10 really powerful Wall Street firms and made them agree to these settlements. And in addition to the SEC, NASD, NYSE, the New York Attorney General, other state regulators all came on board. And analyst firms agreed in principle to separate the research and investment banking. And in our paper, this is covered in gory detail as to what used to be the case and how, why this was quite a landmark event. And the idea was analyst compensation will be based significantly on the quality and accuracy of the analyst research, so which makes our paper so, you can see, so relevant, and cannot be based upon investment banking revenues or input from the IB personnel. So then we have our global financial crisis. Once again, the collapse of Bear Stearns on March 16th, 2008, which was just over a month after the birth of our daughter. So yeah, she is a GFC baby. So you can see the blue here is the financial services weighted daily return, and the red is the S&P 500. So this here covers, the chart covers 2007 to 2011, and you can see how differently and how dramatically things changed in the global financial crisis, which was, as Mahendra has said, it was a crisis of confidence in major financial players, which then was not surprising, followed by the Dodd-Frank Act. And once again, as you can see, look at the alphabet soup, created the OFR to support the FSOC and the new CFPB, which is Senator Elizabeth Warren's idea that self-proclaimed bureaucrats know more about how to manage my money and my family's money than I do. That's their viewpoint. And the Fed were subjected to greater public disclosure by the GAO. Lots of, and there were ideas that more derivatives were to be cleared and traded through regulated exchanges, because, as you know, these some of those exotic derivatives were quite a bit to responsible for the great financial crisis and exited compensation. So this was really quite a regime change in our world. But the most important thing for this paper is FINRA 2241. It is, really exactly FINRA tried to do exactly what we are measuring, that objective research, reliable research, but as would typically happen with these things, they took a legalistic approach to it, the box ticker approach. They were like, okay, all investment banks must create these written policies and procedures. And every time a new analyst starts, they have to take an hour or a 3-hour course where they sign a letter at the thing that they have actually read all of this. So, that's how, the safe harbor provisions that lawyers will insist on, as opposed to, does it actually work? Is it actually about? It's all about creating the right boxes. So that's why then our question is, did FINRA 2241 actually work? So let's look at the results. So the interesting thing is, look at the incremental effect of FINRA 2241. So which is first, second, third, fourth, the fifth row. The empirical probability of diligence increased significantly. Quality of forecast increased significantly. So if you were FINRA, you'll be like, cool, this is great. But let's think about it a little further. We add on the incremental effect. So here now the fifth arrow, we have added the incremental fixed effect of the global financial crisis and the Dodd-Frank plus the incremental effect of FINRA 2241. Look at that row. Nothing is significant. That is to say, while FINRA 2241, the previous thing says, yes, it increased the empirical probability of diligence and the quality of forecast, but just enough to ameliorate the significant deteriorations that happened during or after the GFC. So all FINRA was able to achieve by all these rules was to move things exactly to pre-GFC levels. That was all FINRA was able to achieve. So in the 6 minutes that I have left, so what are the directions for future research? So as I mentioned earlier, you can saw that our regression equations, they are quite sensitive to what we use as the publicly available variables. And our methodologies are very demanding. So for instance, for every ij, we require at least 8 data points. So we require at least 2 years of data in order for ij to be able to measure all these important variables. So empirically demanding. And each additional variable you add on to it, it will require 1 additional quarter to estimate our measures. So one thing that we strongly encourage other researchers to take our paper to the cleaners and see if they are robust to other reasonable publicly available variables. And the last time I spoke with you all, Hamid and I had a very, very nice conversation, and he really educated me about the Australian financial markets. And so, some of the franking things that go on in Australia, for instance, we would love to know if that could be married to our work, and whether how all these hold up. So please, we would very much appreciate the opportunity to get your feedback and to do more work together. The next one, test if these very important measures, diligence, objectivity, moral hazard, accuracy, adverse selection, report quality, differ across countries or financial systems. So for instance, if you are familiar with similar data for Australia, or as I have found with when I deal with my students from mainland China, that a lot of the Hong Kong exchange or the Shanghai exchange, they have actually leapfrogged the legacy systems of Australia and the US, and their data are actually quite a bit more available. Unfortunately, we are not very familiar with the data sources. If you have such data, if you would be so kind as to let us know, and we would also be very interested in collaborating. And finally, the most important of it all is how are these measures of analyst firm behavior how do they work as functions of incentives of analyst and analyst firms? So, for instance, going back to if there is, FINRA, its approach has been, legalistic, safe harbor, put some boxes out, put some written policies that everybody has to just give. But that clearly hasn't worked. How do we provide some guidance to them on what might be the appropriate so in order to do so, we not only have to have a conceptual model of function of a concept of this analyst firm behaviors as functions of these incentives. We need to have a sense of what the social welfare function might be, and we need our empirical analysis to be sufficiently robust to the functional form. And also, we would need to have access to such data, which at this point we do not. And also, this is to go back to perfect segue, Tom. This is something we would love to talk about in the future.
Fantastic, Rajiv. There's been a bit of discussion in the chat about some of the econometrics underlying it. So if indeed, if we're assuming we need to have the positive earnings, right? So one of the things you need for the maximum likelihood estimator, you normally make some assumptions, right, about the distributions of the variables of the error term. So if you're just doing positive, then you don't have normality anymore. You have like a folded normal, right?
Yeah.
So that's a very different distribution to normality. So you could that is a known distribution. So you could probably work with that in your Bayesian estimator. That's just a little point. The editors really don't seem to like two-stage least squares anymore. So they prefer like a more robust, maybe I don't know, instrumental variable, call it instrumental variables. People tend to do the system GMM, which doesn't require any distributional assumptions. So, but maybe just those terms. Another event there in your timeline is regulation fair disclosure. That happened October 2000, I believe. So that's where you can no longer do selective disclosure, which was at the time a big thing. I think there's been a total of 10 prosecutions in 20 years under regulation fair disclosure. So obviously it's something like insider trading. It's there on the books, but it's with draconian measures, but no one actually wants to enforce it. There's a lot going on in the paper, Rajiv and Mahendra, that is probably too much for one paper. While you were going through it, I thought the diligence measure, right, with looking at the diligence models and non-diligence models and coming up with the probability of diligence was ingenious. Same with objectivity, and then leading to probably moral hazard. That might be enough, right, for a paper, and maybe that's like a technical, important, funds management paper or an analyst paper, or something like RFS, or one of the sister journals there in the RFS table. And then the accounting literature is very much interested in the reporting quality. So maybe the adverse selection reporting quality would be a lovely paper for the accounting review, right, or that sort of journal. But there's probably just a little too much going on, and yourself, right? Everyone was following when you were given the intuition, but when you had all those arrows pointing one way and the other way and both ways, and a whole lot of the Persian, Greek, Roman, Germanic languages, symbols, you might have lost a few people, right? So, but you certainly wouldn't lose them if you have this diligence versus non-diligence model, and you explain the intuition of it, and objectivity versus non-objectivity, you explain the intuition of it, and it's quite ingenious to use the Hausmann specification test. And so also, Hamid's been offering some very good input there in the background too around just whether you use the instrumental variables or or something more general. Just that the editors I've taken a real set to the use of the term two-stage least squares.
Thanks, Tom. There's also, I think, a question from Han Lin in the chat about the assumption of homoscedastic variance assumption, and Terry had a question as well. Are you able to see it, Rajiv?
I just saw it. I wasn't able to.
No.
Is there any way? Because I honestly I don't know how to copy these comments onto emails.
I can save it for you, and then I can send it to you.
Oh, that would be great. Hanlin, thank you so very much for that. Then Terry, okay, thank you very much for that. We will, I absolutely have to think about. We'll have to think about it too, as to how we'll have to respond to it. So, so yeah, Lei, that would be great if you could have those.
One possibility, right, is to be able to label some of these analysts as diligent, objectives. What percentage are who are the, you won't be able to say identify them, but what percentage are objective diligent, for example.
Okay, so that will require some kind of like thresholds, right? So what is sufficiently diligent? What is sufficiently?
Right. You can do that based on the probability. So you could do the the terciles or the deciles or the quintiles.
That would be great. Yeah, absolutely.
That could be a financial analyst journal version of it.
Oh, okay.
And a lot more people read that than any of the tier one journal.
Thank you, Tom. All right, Rajiv, I just had two small questions. May or may not be relevant. One is, I was thinking about earnings management. So here you're assuming that the reported earnings are the actual earnings.
Only for the second half of the paper. That's what. Yes, like Tom mentioned, that is something he was saying that might be more of an accounting review part.
Okay, sure.
Without that, and look, I complete that. Without that assumption, we are still able to measure the probabilities of diligence, objectivity, and moral hazard. But in order to tease out accuracy, adverse selection, and quality, we need to make that assumption. So please go on, Lei.
The other one is just, is it all possible to apply this to rating agencies? Because we know that their ratings are not always accurate, they are not always diligent. Is there any way to apply this methodology or a version of it to rating agencies?
Oh, that's such a brilliant idea, Lei. I actually remember, I often tell I've told Mahendra this story. I don't know if he remembers. Is one of my highlights of my time at Olin was when Todd Milburn talked about the credit rating agencies versus analysts in the context of the great financial crisis. It was just brilliant to see, how smart scholars think about it. I just don't know if we have the data on credit rating agencies. I will definitely, over the weekend, look through Words and look through any other data sources that we might have. If you have access to data, for instance, in the Australian context, I think that would be a fabulous application to this methodology, because as I honestly think that the CRAs were quite to be blamed for what happened in the GFC. And we would like to know what the answers to all these regulatory questions would be in that case.
Yeah, because at least during the GFC, we sort of know with a high certainty that the answer is no, right? They weren't doing their job. So any kind of measure should pick that up, I guess.
Right.
You know the answer, so you just need to
right. That would be
actually are consistent, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think the part is that the theoretical structure lends itself very well to the problem that you are posing, and it just requires to basically reposition it within that context, and what you are it's at a broader level. Anytime it says Rajiv was even going and giving a medical example. Anytime when you have multiple agents involved, you can think about applying the similar kind of a theoretical structure. But I'm really intrigued by your question because yes, as Rajiv said, it's a function of lack of data, at least at our end, or our knowledge. But that's a very interesting fertile ground to take this theoretical structure and apply it.
Yeah. Great.
Thanks,
All
Mahendra.
right. I think we're out of time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rajiv, Mahendra, for your paper and your presentation. Hopefully, you've got some good comments to go forward. Yeah, I look forward to you, either one of you presenting again in the future.
Great to see you both. Yeah, great to see
Thank you
everyone.
very much, Tom.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. And please, I hope we can stay well with the floods in New South Wales.
We can actually see sunshine. We can see some sunshine outside. We didn't know what it was initially.
Excellent. I mean, what is Sydney without sunshine, right? I mean, that's such a beautiful, glorious city. And thank you all very, very much once again. Thanks, Mahendra.
Thank you.
And we will, and please, all of you, any of you, if you have any of your thoughts, if you would be so kind to email Mahendra and or me, we'd be very grateful. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye.
See everyone. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Have a great weekend.
You too.